Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you had a lovely weekend. It's very good to see you. You know, we're coming up to the very end of the semester, and this is our last full week or our last week of lectures and classes. And that means we had to make a choice about what to cover in this class. Mainly, it was a choice between social development and policy reform. Both of these topics matter a lot. We did choose to go with policy reform because in the last 30 years, the politics of economic policy reform is perhaps the most or one of the most important literatures in the literature on economic and other forms of development. So policy reform needs to be a focus for us in the class, even if it's the last week of the course. It should be something that we address. And so we're going to focus on policy reform. And if you didn't complete the Morrison reading yet because you planned for the Scott reading, that's okay. Don't worry about that. I do, though, hope that you'll read the Morrison reading for Wednesday or Friday. It's a reading that's pretty quick and that does nicely summarize and connect and synthesize virtually all of the concepts from the course. So in addition to introducing you as a political economist to the topic of policy reform, it also really ties together everything that we've studied so far. So for me, policy reform is a special topic because I've really, to the extent that I have an academic career, I've made my academic career studying policy reform. And really, I um, kind of helped to extend the politics of policy reform to the area of the defense sector and defense industrialization. So my research has involved really kind of repurposing a lot of the core concepts and analytical perspectives from the literature from the past 40 years and sort of fitting them and tailoring them to questions about the defense industry and about how defense sector institutions evolve and change. So for me, I look at this from that perspective. And so I'll talk a lot about institutional reform and maybe the role of information. But I want to begin in a really, really general way. And before we get into any question of the causes of reform or the effects of reform or really even how to study or think about reform, we need to first think about reform in terms of where it fits in a larger process. And really, the question I want to begin with before we get into that even is what is reform? And what do we mean by economic policy reform or policy change? How should we understand that? And so before we continue today, I'm going to actually open up a fresh document, and don't all race for the exits now because this is going to be a collaborative activity, but it doesn't require a great deal from you. And I think that you'll benefit from being here. So give me a second to open this up. So the question that we're going to begin with is, what do we mean by economic policy reform? It seems so monolithic. And before we even begin to discuss the concept or how it's been understood, I want to begin here with a very general discussion. So, can anyone start us off? What do we mean by policy reform?
A change in rules.
Okay, great. What kinds of rules?
Rules for citizens to abide by.
in a particular domain of social life or just in general? With regard to the economy, I should say.
Can you say, yeah, can you
Eco-
say a change in rules in regard to the economy in
Yeah.
order for it to be more efficient?
So there's a lot there. And first and foremost, you're right, Christiana, it's a change in rules that govern the economy. So we often try to change the rules because we have ideas about the efficiency gains that the change will produce. That's often what motivates us. But that's actually a separate component. The motivation in the ideological framework that guides us is part of the story. But before we even get there, we want to conceptualize reform as just in the simplest sense, a change in rules that govern the economy. We know from this class that the economy is made up of actors, but also institutions. And those institutions are really made up of rules, rules about what actors can and cannot do, rules about ownership and the intervention of the state, or the role and responsibility of the private sector, or the role and responsibility of the state, and so on and so forth. When we talk about economic policy reform, we're talking about a change in the rules that govern the economy and that pertain to the relative roles and responsibilities of the private sector and the state. You see, political economy is all about the relationship between individuals and society, but really it's about the state and the private sector, because the private sector contains society and individuals, and the state, as an institution or as an organization, delimits the private sector. And so when we change the rules of the economy, we're really talking about changing the rules regarding the roles and the responsibilities of the private sector versus the state. And so this helps to connect a lot of different themes that we've discussed in the class. And it creates a framework and kind of a conceptual basis for us that is useful going forward. Now, there's a lot else here, though, that we need to pick out too. So Christiana added a change in rules governing the economy in order to achieve efficiency gains. Now, that sounds like neoliberal reform, market driven reform, where we reduce the role of the state and we increase the role of the private sector. And we're very familiar with that kind of reform. That's one kind of reform. That's a sort of orthodox market driven reform. But recent research in political economy has shown us and reminded us that really that's only one possibility. There's also another possibility, which is that the state actually takes on new interventionist roles or refines its role in the economy in some way that is more heterodox or that is more interventionist or statist in orientation. And so, in that regard, efficiency might not be a consideration. It might be a consideration, though, that the state wants to produce a good or a service that the private sector is not currently providing that could generate or promote development. The state might have a variety of political and economic objectives that motivate the state to take interventionist measures that would also qualify as reforms. So these reforms can be market driven or state driven, depending upon whose role and responsibility these are basic but important ideas that we need to be thinking about. And so I'm going to now go to the chat and incorporate some more of the input. Alondra points out it's changes to the current status quo. That's exactly right. It's changes to the status quo. And changes is the key, because every reform involves at least two changes. Rady says changes in policies that affect the economy. And there's an important note there. Who has policies? The state, right? Even if it's a policy of no intervention, that's a policy. So it's really a change in the policies regarding the role and the responsibilities of the state that has direct implications for the private sector, because a shrinking of the state or a withdrawal of the state will mean necessarily an expansion or an opening for the private sector. But there's a central role for the state. We're thinking first and foremost about the policies of the state, in how the state's role changes, in how this is critical and central to the idea of reform or policy change. And Anieli says a change in formal institutions in regards to economic growth. Good, that's a nice note. A change in formal institutions. So Anieli points out that growth is often the objective. This is true. Heterodox as well as orthodox reforms are essentially motivated by the same goal, which is to promote growth or promote some sort of meeting of a need that is not currently met. And so in this regard, growth is essentially always the objective. It's just that states and governments can pursue a variety of different pathways or strategies to development. This reminds me of the first reading I assigned from this semester, the Roderick piece on policies and the state's role in promoting growth. And Roderick takes a very nuanced view where he acknowledges the role of the private sector, but also acknowledges that the state plays a key role as well, and through policy, in the development of policies that are pro-growth. These policies can be orthodox and market driven, or they can be statist and heterodox, and they can involve an expansion or a rise and increase in the state's role and responsibility, either in the form of the creation of state enterprises or the creation of tight limits on the domain of private sector activity, tax or subsidy policies or industrial policies designed to facilitate or promote certain kinds of production in the private sector. They can do a lot of different things to affect growth and affect development, and affect the economy. And so there's a lot that falls under that that umbrella. Yes, Christiana, I can elaborate. Christiana is asking, can you elaborate on what you mean by market-driven versus state-driven? Market-driven means that private sector actors are the key actors in the development strategy, and state-driven means that the state and its institutions and enterprises are the key actors in the development strategy. And
Professor,
yes, Christiana.
to clarify, like this is policy in general. It's not like looking in a certain, like at a certain type of institution, correct?
Correct. We're starting at a very abstract and general level. So we're thinking about different types of policy changes. You can increase the role of the state, or you can reduce the role of the state, and both would constitute a reform technically. And so we're trying to think about reform or change in a more nuanced way than has typically been the case. And this is how then we can think about heterodox as well as orthodox policy changes. So this is very general. This isn't in the case of any institution, but you can imagine that we can be talking about trade policy or fiscal policy or industrial policy. We could be talking about different policy areas, but generally speaking, a development strategy has to do with what are the key actors driving the process of growth, and who is chiefly involved in this investment process that we agree that is so important. And so What we have so far is a picture of economic reform and economic policy reform that is multi-headed. It's not monolithic. We can envision orthodox policy changes that involve a loosening and a reduction of the role of the state and an increased role for the market in the form of setting prices and allocating resources, private enterprise and driving production. But we can also involve the state at a higher level where the state is more involved in setting prices, more involved in producing certain goods, more involved in restricting the domain of private enterprise, more involved in allocating credit or determining the exchange rate, and so on and so forth. In a moment, I'll show you and I'll remind you of the key policies associated with the Washington Consensus, which is one reform strategy or one reform pathway, but only one of a variety of different pathways that we can imagine falling under the rubric of reform. But this then is a nuanced and a more sophisticated picture. It doesn't restrict us to just thinking about market oriented changes. It doesn't restrict us to thinking about state associated changes. It has us thinking about a variety of different kinds of changes that could occur and how we could think about reform in different ways. Now, this is important because between about 1980 and 2010, the focus was almost exclusively on the neoliberal types of reforms, the market oriented reforms, the ones that reduced the role of the state and increased the role of the market. So much so that as late as 2005 and 10, there wasn't even an acknowledgement that reforms or policy changes could actually also increase the role of the state. Key articles wouldn't even define what they meant by reform. Only recently have political economists begun to think about reform in a more sophisticated way. The new political economy is correcting the Washington Consensus and thinking about reform and policy change in a more nuanced, in a more multidimensional way. It's a multi-headed creature. It doesn't confine us to just neoliberal policy changes. It also allows for the possibility that policy change can increase the role of the state and reduce the role of the market. And so this is our starting point. Today, what we're going to do is continue exploring the concept and the idea of policy reform. We'll take a look at the nature of the process. We'll review the meaning of the Washington Consensus, and we'll think about that earlier concept of reform in conjunction with the experiences in Latin America, East Asia, also post-Soviet republics and Eastern Europe. And what we'll ultimately do is think about the experience in Eastern Europe, think about the varieties of transformation, the varieties of reform that we've witnessed, and we'll think about the performance of different reformers in different transition economies. We'll also think about institutions and some of the factors that appear to promote performance and promote growth through the transition. But this entire discussion today will be about policy reform and about changes or differences in types of reform and policy reform episodes that result in growth and policy reform episodes that result in stagnation. This discussion won't address the causes of reform or the causes of variation in performance. We'll address that lightly, but only on Wednesday and Friday will we address in a more systematic and analytical way the causes of variation in reform, why policy reform efforts succeed or fail. We'll talk in particular on Wednesday and Friday about the politics and the role of coalitions, rent seeking, et cetera. But today we're going to begin at a more rudimentary level, and we'll begin by conceptualizing and thinking about reform as a process and as a series of policies or as a series of changes that might be associated with an increased role of the state, as well as a reduced role of the state. And so we'll return then to the lecture. And I want to begin to bring your attention to a model of policy change. This is the reform process in a very abstract, general sense. We begin always with a leader. And this is going to be a president or a prime minister, someone at the head of a coalition, a governing coalition or a winning coalition or reform coalition. The precise nature of that political circumstance will vary based on whether it's a presidential or a parliamentary system, but virtually always we begin with a leader who is in government, and they have preferences. They have preferences regarding the type of policy change, the type of economic reform, the type of change to the formal institutions governing the economy that they would like to see. This preference, though, can vary. Now, they may prefer a neoliberal, market oriented, orthodox policy reform. That is, they might reform the state and reduce the state's role in the economy and increase the role of the private sector. This would involve privatizing state enterprises. It would involve reducing fiscal spending. It would involve letting credit be allocated by private banks and driven by market forces. It would involve exchange rates being set as on the market as opposed to by governments. It would involve a variety of changes to the state's role in the economy and an increased role for the private sector. Now, this is the standard neoliberal route that for 30 years, political economists in the literature treated as the only way to do reform. This is this one right here. And in this pathway, the reformer, the orthodox reformer, encounters political conflict. And the resistance that they encounter is then sort of filtered through political institutions. And the ways that the conflict affect the leader in their legislative agenda will determine the extent of the policy shift ultimately. Now, this is very abstract, and on Wednesday and Friday, we'll go into more detail talking about what kinds of factors reduce the level of conflict and what kinds of factors block opposition to reform, thus permitting successful reform. There are a variety of different circumstances that can work against opposition to reform, and we can discuss those in detail. But always, always, the neoliberal reformer pursuing these orthodox market-oriented reforms encounters conflict, and it's a product of the conflict in the policy agenda, just how much policy changes ultimately. And this is how much policy changes here. This is the reform outcome. We can kind of think of a dividing line between the process itself and then the outcome. The process contains the preferences, the conflict, and then the outcome contains the extent of policy change. That is, the extent to which the status quo has been transformed, the change from the status quo, to put it in a more formal way. No, Rady, that's not your ignorance. Don't worry. Let me elaborate what that means. Rady is asking, what does it mean, orthodox and heterodox policy preferences? So those orthodox policy preferences are those neoliberal policy preferences. A preference for reducing the role of the state, a preference for privatizing state enterprises, a preference for allowing prices in the allocation of credit to be determined by market forces, a preference for the market determining the exchange rate, a preference for reducing fiscal spending, and so on. These are those neoliberal policy preferences that we're so familiar with. That's the orthodox model. Now, the heterodox model is really the opposite. The heterodox model involves increasing the role of the state or adjusting and refining the role of the state so as to pursue specific political and economic objectives, to use the state institutions, to set up state enterprises in specific sectors, to use industrial policy, to promote certain kinds of production in the private sector, to actively use state institutions and resources to pursue specific kinds of policy changes or adjustments that don't necessarily involve increasing the role of the private sector. It may involve increasing the role of the state, but they're different than those neoliberal preferences because it doesn't involve reducing the role of the state. It involves increasing the role of the state and adapting the state to the challenges confronted by the leader and the policymakers. And so the orthodox preferences are neoliberal. The heterodox preferences are more statist. They're more pragmatic. It's a opposition and a rejection of neoliberal preferences. But we refer to them as heterodox because for 35 years, the orthodox neoliberal policy agenda was the sole way of thinking about reform. So we're thinking about reform in a more sophisticated way. The policy preferences of the leader can be orthodox and neoliberal, or they can be more heterodox and more unconventional according to the conventional wisdom. But even the heterodox preferences encounter political conflict because any change to the status quo, even if it involves an increased role for the state, can involve a change in institutions that impose losses on the actors vested in the existing system. Any change from the status quo can change the distribution of benefits, the distribution of power. Any change, therefore, can generate political conflict because it provokes opposition to change. Any proposed policy reform can provoke and will provoke opposition to change because the actors are vested in the status quo. Their benefits and their power depend upon the status quo. And so in both scenarios, in both types of worlds, the outcome itself is a product of really the interaction between the political conflict and the preferences of the leader. The political conflict will affect the success of the leader's policy agenda. And we'll talk on Wednesday and Friday about what kinds of institutions and what sorts of coalitions or what sorts of variables will overcome the opposition to reform. And there are a number that are important to keep in mind. But in a very abstract way, this is how we can conceive of the process of policy change. Now, are there any questions about orthodox or heterodox policy preferences? Is it clear what we mean when we distinguish between those two? Now, as a reminder, the political conflict comes from the fact that the leader, in trying to change the status quo, threatens the beneficiaries of the status quo because their power and their benefits depend on the status quo. So when you try to change the formal institutions, the formal rules of the economy, you're threatening the benefits in the power of the actors vested in that status quo. And therefore, you provoke conflict because they take up arms, metaphorically, sometimes literally, in opposition to you. And this is where the conflict comes from. Now, the orthodox policy. For 30 years, this was the way we thought about reform. To Christiana's question, what kinds of reforms or what sorts of institutions do we mean in particular? Well, this is the bundle that we associate with the orthodox reform pathway. We call it the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus is a set of 10 policies that gained the agreement in the consensus of economists, policymakers, and leaders in the development community in the 1990s in Washington, D.C. And so when you see that word consensus, you should ask, well, who's consenting? Mainly a narrow group of elites in development policy circles in Washington, D.C. in the 80s and the 90s. But let's continue. What policies did they associate with reform? And what policies became so intimately connected to reform in the literature that for 30 years, neoliberal reform or orthodox reform was the only kind of reform? First and foremost, fiscal discipline. Spend less money, balance budgets to the extent that you can, borrow less, pay down existing debt, all sorts of disciplined approaches to financing that the Washington elites claimed developing countries had neglected. Reorder your public expenditure priorities. Less spending on social welfare and education, less spending on subsidies for public services, state enterprises. In general, spend only to the extent that you need to, and only to the extent that you need to ensure compliance with the rules of a market economy. Third, tax reform. Lower the rates on top earners, and in particular, those who have capital investments, and those whom this school and perspective argued were most inclined to contribute to growth. Fourth, make sure that interest rates are market determined, not determined by state institutions or by public institutions that make credit available or determine the access to credit. Fifth, competitive exchange rates. Make sure that exchange rates, the price of the country's currency, are determined by supply and demand forces on the international currency market, as opposed to determined by central authorities in economic institutions in the state, which previously were heavily involved in setting fixed rates guided by national policy priorities. The definition of the Washington Consensus, it's just a set of policies that development organizations like the World Bank and economists in Washington, D.C. increasingly agreed on in the 1990s as an antidote to economic crises in developing countries that had mainly pursued import substitution industrialization. This is the set of policies. It's just a set of policies that economists and the development community increasingly agreed on and promoted as a solution to economic crises. The definition of the consensus is less important. The policies themselves are more important. Openness to foreign direct investment. This meant liberalizing the capital account so that foreigners could invest, either buying and maybe setting up factories or simply moving their money into domestic banks. Privatization. This meant, as a reminder, transferring the ownership of firms to the private sector. These were state industries that previously had been developed by the state as part of a concerted effort to pursue import substitution industrialization. So the Washington Consensus had everything to do with privatizing those firms and shifting production to the private sector, getting the state out of business. Similarly, there was deregulation, removing restrictions on business and prices so that firms could operate more freely and they didn't have to obey various rules about for instance, worker rights or environmental protection. And then finally, property rights protection. We know that well. It has to do with the right of individuals to own and liquidate property. These were the policies associated with the neoliberal Washington Consensus, the revolution in economics that had everything to do with reducing the role of the state and increasing the role of the private market. This was an orthodox policy agenda, and it had to do with conventional ways of responding to crisis as far as the economics discipline was concerned. So for 30 years, this was how reform was understood. But the way that reform was understood increasingly stood in contrast to how the transition economies performed, because there was a lot of variation from country to country in how they seemed to do over the long term after transitioning from statist to more private economies, the transition from ISI to a more neoliberal model that we've talked so much about in this class. So the Washington Consensus expected and anticipated and said that countries would experience generally the benefits of neoliberal reform and that they would grow correspondingly. But countries exhibited a lot of variation in their success upon implementing Washington Consensus reforms. And moreover, some of the countries that grew the most were the ones that seemed to be the most unorthodox in their approach to development. And so, very quickly, the Washington Consensus and the neoliberal model began to run aground and began to fray. So, between 1990 and 1992, for instance, GDP fell 15% from 1989 numbers in Czechoslovakia, but 75% in Georgia. That fall in Czechoslovakia was relatively modest, considering that it was a transition and that unemployment is expected. But the fall in Georgia was extraordinary and extraordinarily bad. And it suggested that a great deal of variation was inherent in the experiences of the transition economies. And then the differences between East Asia and Latin America were also extraordinary. Consider experiences like that of South Korea and Taiwan, where they grew at robust rates, but largely as a result of state involvement and guidance of the economy. It wasn't a clear-cut example of neoliberal development at all. It was a development of statist development, an example of statist development, excuse me. But what's more striking is that it wasn't even just that East Asia grew so much despite a more statist orientation. The Latin American countries pursued neoliberal reform very aggressively. But the Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina, Bolivia, stagnated. So whereas East Asian countries that were more statist and more almost ISI in their orientation grew very quickly, Latin American countries that were more aggressive in their neoliberal orientation stagnated. And so what happened was economists in the development community began to realize that the success of reform varies tremendously with initial conditions. Political and economic conditions and historical circumstances vary from country to country. And the neoliberal policies are the same from country to country. And so it shouldn't be surprising that when you impose the same formula in countries that nevertheless vary a great deal, that the results also vary, that the performance of those economies vary, and that the outcomes are in no way uniform. It occurred to everyone involved that even if neoliberal reforms were successful in some cases in producing performance and efficiency gains, in others they were not, and that there had to be something else that was missing, and that the neoliberal policies by themselves couldn't do all the work. And so increasingly, they started to focus on institution building, improving the rule of law, transparency, reducing corruption, strengthening institutions of the state that are involved in supporting market institutions. You see, if we've learned anything from this class, we've learned that the economy does not exist in a vacuum. It essentially depends on the state. State institutions institutionalize markets and codify and create the foundation and support and perpetuate markets. And so neoliberal policy reforms also require a set of political and institutional reforms that help to support and promote the kinds of benefits and patterns of growth that neoliberalism has the potential to generate. And so these have to do with strengthening key state institutions, economic institutions that are involved in supporting property rights, in supporting and mediating economic exchange, in disseminating information, in strengthening financial institutions and access to credit. This has to do with redesigning the role of the state. It's not a shrinking of the role of the state. A new era is upon us. For about 15 years, the recognition has been that markets alone are insufficient, and that the state's role is more important than ever, and that this is a matter of redesigning and refining and strengthening the role of the state, not shrinking or reducing or eliminating the state. In fact, without the state, the market would cease to exist. And in 2008, we saw that in vivid detail when Lehman collapsed and the entirety of the global financial system hung in the balance. And it came down to the Fed as the lender of last resort, the survival of the global economy. So this is where we are. The post Washington consensus has to do with this recognition that markets alone are insufficient and that states too must be adapted to circumstances on the ground. But this also means that programs should vary from country to country, and that there should be a redesigning and a rethinking of policy reform. There should be an adaptation of policy reform to the prevailing circumstances in a given country. Reform should not be viewed as a one size fits all issue. It should be thought of as a variable, a flexible, adaptive thing that is molded to the circumstances on the ground and that involves improvements in economic as well as political institutions. And those improvements can involve an increase or a reduction in the role of the state. It depends on whether the leader pursues an orthodox or an unorthodox policy. And so this is where we are. This recognition that policy reform is not one size fits all. Even if the policies are all the same, and even if we suggest a similar set of policies, the fact is that countries differ in terms of the conjunction and the distribution of interests and the distribution of power between economic actors. And when those distributions differ, it means that countries differ in terms of their political and their historical and their economic circumstances. So every country will involve a process of slicing up the cake that is different. The process will be different. The slicing will be different. The actors will be different. They'll have different interests in different capacities. And so reform is not one size fits all. It has much more to do with a dialogue between standards and practices that may be more or less neoliberal and circumstances, political, economic, and historical in the countries on the ground. And we learn this from looking at the experiences in the developing world. Now, we know a lot about Latin America, and you know that Latin America has oscillated back and forth between markets and states, and that the most recent period saw an extended reign of leftist governments and a return to the state, more or less. But Eastern Europe also shows a great deal of variation too. And it also shows that reform can be pursued to varying degrees, and that different types of reforms can be pursued as well. And because we know so much about Latin America, I thought that it would be useful for us to consider the Eastern European experience and what that looks like. So in Eastern Central Europe, in the Baltics, countries pursued deeper reforms. They pursued deeper privatization, and they also pursued more extensive institution building and strengthening. This had to do with political as well as economic innovations, and it meant a deeper transformation than in countries like, say, Russia and Belarus, which we'll discuss in a moment. But what is it that these countries had in common that might help us to begin to understand the depth and the strength and the aggressiveness of the reforms and the multidimensional nature of the reforms? Well, the initial conditions were such that they had lived under communism for a shorter period. The systems had also been more democratic in terms of the politics. They had stronger civil societies. These factors mean that there was more pre-existing support and more capacity within society to accept reform. Also, when they had lived under communism for a shorter period, that meant that the post-authoritarian elites, the communist elites, were weaker because they didn't consolidate for as long a period as they did in other countries. Now, this meant that all told, the political economy was more conducive and more supportive of these kinds of deep reforms at the very outset. And so political as well as economic institution building and change was involved in this process of reform. Now, it was also the case that these countries were less dependent on natural resources. Natural resources have been shown to negatively relate to institutional reform because the natural resources produce a lot of lootable wealth that sloshes around in the state, and that generates a lot of vested interests, and it makes it especially difficult to reform the system because those deep vested interests are better organized and they benefit from those natural resources, and so they're stronger and they're capable of resisting reform. So countries less dependent on natural resources have an easier time. This is only a start to a foray into the analysis of the causes of reform that we'll engage in. But there's one more factor that I'll mention before I let you go, and that is the fact that these countries had the prospect of joining the European Union, which generated a very strong external motivation for reform. It created an anchor, if you will, a driver, gave leaders a powerful incentive to pursue aggressive reform. And so, all told, the politics, the economics, the original initial natural resource endowments, the international relationships, all pointed in the direction of reform and created a situation that was relatively conducive to change. Now, as we'll talk about on Wednesday, this is not always the case. Other countries have political and economic circumstances that are far less conducive and supportive of reform. And Russia is one of those countries. Russia is a country that did not pursue reform. And in fact, many of the same old power brokers and economic and political interests have perpetuated themselves, and the system has not changed much at all. But we'll talk about that on Wednesday. We've only just begun to discuss reform and policy reform and transformation. We're off to a very good start. Thanks for your engagement today. I'll see you on Wednesday.